Can we assist again? Such a run. My bad, JJ. That was an extra call, JJ, for 66. That was 2629, 3210. 40 cars off, we let golf, turn left on November, and contact ground point down on the other side.
On the 5th of November 1997, the aircraft was operating a scheduled passenger service from Los Angeles to London Heathrow. On board were about 114 people, 98 passengers and 16 crew members. What followed was not a crash, but a serious mechanical failure that tested crew judgments, system knowledge, and decision making over several hours. Stay tuned. The aircraft was crewed by two highly experienced pilots. The captain himself held an airline transport pilot license with approximately 10,500 total flight hours, including around 1,700 on the Airbus A340. The first officer was also fully qualified with approximately 7,500 total flight hours, including around 1,200 on the type, which is the Airbus A340 as well. There was no evidence of fatigue or medical impairments or training deficiencies on the crew. Both pilots were really experienced and were familiar with long-haul operations. The aircraft in question today was approximately 4 years old, fully serviceable and maintained with accordance to approved schedules. There were no prior defects relevant to the landing gear system or any prior history relating to similar failures on this aircraft. She was well serviced and she was good to go for today's flight. The planned total flight time from Los Angeles to London was just over 10 hours. The aircraft departed Los Angeles International Airport without any incidents. So the taxi, the takeoff, the initial climb, everything was all normal. So the crew set off to go. However, shortly after takeoff, when the crew retracted the landing gears or the wheels, they noticed that the sequence took a little bit longer than expected, but they didn't think much of it, and no warnings were generated, and the cockpit indications eventually showed that the landing gears were up and locked. So with no further alerts, the flight continued normally and proceeded on its planned route to London. At some point during the cruise phase, a system message was recorded relating to a brake temperature sensor on the left main landing gear. This message hinted at a fault with the sensor itself as opposed to the brakes. But now, it is important for you to know that these brake temperature sensors are not a safety hazard in flight, as the brakes are inactive once the flight is airborne. So the crew assessed the message in accordance with standard procedures, to which it was eventually judged as non-time critical, meaning a diversion was not required and there were no immediate actions required by the crew. So they just assumed it was a faulty reading on the system and they continued their flight towards London Heathrow. The flight went on as normal without any more events, and as the aircraft approached London, the crew began configuring it for landing. At about 8 miles from landing, or the runway, the crew selected the landing gear to the down position. But the cockpit indications showed that the left main landing gear failed to lock down in the down position. As they kept descending, the crew made several attempts to recycle the landing gear. They took it back up, brought it back down. They made several attempts, as they descended, but the left gear remained unsafe. So, at approximately 2.5 miles from touchdown, with the aircraft not correctly configured, a go-around was initiated. So then, they got into contact with air traffic control, and the aircraft was vectored into a holding pattern, while the crew began systematic troubleshooting. Luckily, they were within radio range of Virgin Atlantic's operation department in Heathrow, This then allowed the crew to receive direct and managerial support from the ground. So a series of suggestions were passed to the captain aimed at resolving the landing gear problem. These included resetting and pulling relevant LGIU and system circuit breakers, recycling the landing gear selectors, and repeating the gravity extension procedure, a procedure that allows the landing gear to retract under the weight of gravity as opposed to hydraulic power. However, despite exhausting all available options, the landing gear's condition did not improve. At this point, it was starting to become clear to the crew that they would have to face the likelihood of landing with an abnormal main gear configuration. One thing to note that is, at this point, they were only relying on their sensors. You understand? So from inside the aircraft, the crew had no way to directly observe the physical position of the landing gear. So to fully assess the situation before committing to a landing, the captain, in consultation with the company's engineering and managing team, decided to conduct a low fly pass over Heathrow's control tower. Prior to the low fly pass, both normal landing gear procedures and the gravity extension checklist had already been completed, just to ensure that as much of the landing gear was visible as possible, or as much as the landing gear as possible was extended. As the aircraft approached the control tower, the captain banked the aircraft to the right at approximately 300 feet above ground level, exposing the underside for ground observations. A company engineer was positioned in the tower and confirmed that the left main landing gear was hanging within the gear bay. This information was relayed to the crew by air traffic control. A second low fly pass was requested. However, trafficking departing from parallel runway prevented the aircraft from repositioning safely for another pass. And around this time, the aircraft generated the low fuel quantity alert, indicating approximately 5,400 kilograms of fuel remaining, which is about 50 minutes of flight time. Following the fuel alert, the captain elected not to attempt another fly pass and not to divert to an unfamiliar airfield. Well, given the circumstances, these decisions were reasonable and appropriate, and the focus shifted to fully conducting a controlled landing at Heathrow. As a final attempt to assist the landing gear, it was suggested that the aircraft be maneuvered to apply additional G loading. Now let me explain that. So basically, the idea was that vertical and lateral G forces generated during brief runway contact might free the jammed landing gear and allow it to lock. Basically, a suggestion to bounce the aircraft off the runway surface to potentially knock the landing gear out of its bay. This technique was not recommended by procedures and carried significant risks, including loss of control or structural damage to the remaining landing gear. So therefore, the crew elected not to attempt this maneuver, choosing instead a fully controlled landing with emergency services positioned. During this phase, the crew also discussed whether or not to shut down one or more engines prior to landing. The intention was to reduce the risk of fire if the engines contacted the runway. However, shutting down the engines would reduce electrical and hydraulic power, which were considered critical for aircraft control, braking, and directional stability. This increased the risk of the crew losing control on touchdown due to lack of power. Engines 1 and 4 were planned to be shut down on touchdown to maintain symmetrical thrust and reduce the risk of fire, as they would be the first to contact the runway on touchdown if there was a roll. Engine 2 was to be shut down as the left wing was lowered to reduce the risk of fire, and engine 3 was retained as long as possible to supply power to the flight controls, computers, and systems. All engines would eventually be shut down during the final stage of landing roll. So following this discussion, at about 16:08, a formal mayday was declared, giving the aircraft absolute total priority. All other inbound traffic was held in London holding stacks. Runway 27 left was selected so that any potential swing caused by engine contact with the runway would not direct the aircraft towards the terminal area. So cabin crew were briefed, passengers were informed, and the cabin was prepared for a possible abnormal landing and evacuation. Full emergency services were rapidly deployed, and the runway environment was cleared of all other traffic and equipment. The aircraft touched down on the right main landing gear, slightly to the right of the center line, near the touchdown zone. The touchdown was gentle and balanced, with a crosswind from the left. The landing was captured on video by emergency services. Approximately 9 seconds after touchdown, the aircraft was gently banked to the right to delay the loss of lift on the left wing. However, as the aircraft pivoted, the number 4 engine pod made brief contact with the runway, sending sparks flying. During the landing, the aircraft was held slightly right wing low, delaying contact with the left side for as long as possible. But as speed reduced, the left side of the aircraft made contact with the runway. Despite the asymmetric contact, the aircraft remained controllable and decelerated to a complete stop. Now, once the aircraft had come to a complete stop, the captain ordered an immediate evacuation. Although there was no post-impact fire, the condition of the aircraft, with the engines damaged and the fuselage being in direct contact with the runway, this just meant there was no need to delay the evacuation any further. The cabin crew initiated evacuation procedures without hesitations. Slides were deployed and passengers were directed away from the aircraft. Now, due to the aircraft's final position, not all exits were usable. Cabin crew assessed each door individually and only opened those exits that were considered safe based on the aircraft's position, slide deployment, and proximity to the ground. Several passengers sustained minor injuries, but it was mostly from them descending from the slides, or as a result of uneven ground contact after leaving the aircraft. In total, about 7 minor injuries were recorded, 5 passengers and 2 members of the cabin crew. Emergency services reached the aircraft rapidly and assisted passengers once they were clear of the slides. Medical attention was provided on the scene and no injuries were classified as serious. The evacuation was completed quickly and all occupants were accounted for. There were no fatalities. So, the investigation determined that the incident was caused by a mechanical failure within the left main landing gear assembly. A torque link pin, part of the brake torque reaction system, became dislodged just after takeoff. And once this pin moved out of position, the associated brake torque rod was able to foul the landing gear mechanism. This was purely a mechanical jam. There was no hydraulic failure or electrical faults or even loss of system pressure. And because this failure occurred after takeoff, there were no pre-flight indications that could have alerted the crew. The brake temperature sensor message seen during cruise was later identified as a secondary effect, not the root cause. Once the obstruction existed, neither normal extension nor recycling the gear nor gravity extension could have overcome it. So the crew were stuck in that situation no matter what they did, so they just had to commit to the landing. Subsequent examination confirmed that maneuvering the aircraft or applying additional G-load was unlikely to have freed the jammed gear. So the option of bouncing the aircraft off the runway was not going to work. In summary, a single mechanical failure created an irreversible gear jam, leaving the crew to manage the landing with an abnormal configuration. The outcome of flights 024 was the result of calm crew coordination, procedural discipline, and measured decision making under sustained abnormal condition. What could have easily escalated into a far more serious event remained a control incident, and because of that, every person on board survived. This is one of those stories that's really inspiring because the crew literally experienced something that the manufacturer had not accounted for, and they had to modify, the checklist that was available to them, come up with different strategies to shut down the engine so as to prevent fire risk and save the life of everyone on board. Personally, if you ask me, I think these pilots deserve some type of accolades, but there was no report to show that. This was a really, really inspiring story, and if you enjoyed it, consider leaving a like, leaving a comments about what you think about this story, subscribing to see when we drop more stories. This is Aviation with Fails, and I'll catch you in the next one.